What if I told you that our ideas about medieval winters, full of cozy fireside gatherings and snowy celebrations, are just a beautiful illusion? Behind the glamour of nightly tournaments and castle walls lay a completely different reality, in which the main enemy was not man, but the climate itself. It was an era when a single harsh winter could destroy an entire kingdom, and an army could freeze to death without firing a single shot. Watch the video to the end to learn how ordinary rain in the spring of 1315 set off a chain reaction that changed the course of European history. What if I told you that everything you believed about medieval disasters wasn't entirely true? The greatest famine of the 14th century did not begin with snow or frost, but with endless, cold rain. In the spring of 1315, the heavens above northern Europe seemed to open up, and water poured down for weeks, then months. This event was the first act of the tragedy we know as the Great Famine, which changed the continent. The historical chronicles of the time are full of despair and bewilderment. People watched as their fields turned into impassable swamps. Seeds sown in the ground did not sprout, but simply rotted in the cold slush. This was not just bad weather. It was a complete disruption of the natural cycle on which medieval society depended. This period was the beginning of what climatologists would later call the Little Ice Age. Average annual temperatures began to fall, and weather anomalies became the norm. But in 1315, people did not know this. They only saw that spring did not bring warmth, summer did not bring sunshine, and the familiar world was collapsing before their eyes. The failed sowing meant only one thing: a catastrophically small harvest in the fall. The grain that was harvested was sparse, damp, and often already rotten. The barns that were supposed to feed people throughout the winter remained almost empty. The coming cold season promised to be a real test of survival. The psychological impact of this endless rain was enormous. People lost hope. Each new gray day, when water poured from the sky, exacerbated the feeling of doom. Prayers in churches did not help, and it seemed that the world itself had turned against man. But there was another, less obvious problem caused by the rain. Salt, a vital preservative for medieval man, became incredibly expensive. The main method of obtaining it was by evaporating seawater or salt solutions in the sun. In conditions of constant cloudiness and rain, this process came to a virtual standstill. Without salt, it was impossible to preserve the little meat that could be obtained for the winter. Fish caught in rivers could not be salted for long-term storage either. This meant that people had no protein reserves other than what they could find here and now. When the first frosts finally hit in the fall of 1315, they found a population that was already on the brink. People had no grain and no pickles. Winter had not even really begun, and food prices had already skyrocketed, making food unaffordable for most. It was a perfect storm of circumstances created by the climate. Rain destroyed the harvest, and lack of sun destroyed the means of preserving it. Medieval society was entering one of the darkest periods of its history, completely unprepared for the onslaught of the elements. Every peasant, every townsman, and every lord understood that the coming winter would not just be harsh, it would be a struggle for basic survival. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Do you think it was just a series of bad weather events or the natural result of man's dependence on nature? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about what happened when food supplies ran out completely? The winter of 1315-1316 went down in history as a time of great famine that affected almost all of Europe. It was not a sudden disaster, but one that had been brewing for some time. It was all due to the cold and rainy summer of 1315. The fields did not have time to yield a harvest. The grain sprouted right in the ears, and the hay rotted in the meadows. When the frost hit, the meager supplies that had been gathered ran out with frightening speed. People who had hoped for a miracle in the fall realized by winter that there was no more food. Bread prices skyrocketed to astronomical heights. Chronicles report that the cost of wheat increased eightfold and oats and rye sixfold. For an ordinary peasant family, this meant the end of their normal life. Bread, which had been the staple of their diet, became a rare luxury. People sold their clothes, tools, and even land just to get a few loaves that would last a few days. Desperate bargaining took place in the markets, where the last piece of bread was worth more than silver. The situation was no better in the cities, where once the smells of roasted meat and fresh pastries wafted through the air, now there was a heavy atmosphere of hunger. Bakers guarded their warehouses and merchants locked their shops. Those who still had supplies defended them with weapons in their hands. At night, crowds of desperate people roamed the streets. A mother might take bread from a child of another family to save her own. Society was falling apart at the seams, and the usual laws no longer applied. The most terrible decision that had to be made was to eat seed grain, the very grain that was intended for spring sowing. It was a choice between death now and death later. But when hunger drove people mad, the future ceased to exist. People boiled the grain, ground it with straw, and baked gray, bitter bread that did not satisfy their hunger, but only tormented their stomachs. By eating their seed supply, the peasants effectively deprived themselves of spring, but there was no other way out. When the grain ran out, people began to eat things that had never been considered food. They boiled tree bark, gathered lichens and roots, and ground acorns and nutshells to make a flour-like paste. From this, they baked flat cakes that were as hard as stone. Some ate moss, cobwebs, and even the leather of their shoes soaked in water. These pitiful substitutes only prolonged life a little. The chronicles mention cases when people ate dead animals, and sometimes even the bodies of the dead. Hunger deprived people of their humanity and destroyed all moral boundaries. The authorities tried to take action, but their capabilities were negligible. Kings and lords issued decrees on fixed prices for bread, but merchants hid grain, expecting even greater growth. Where supplies were found, riots broke out. In some cities, the guards opened the granaries and distributed grain to the people, but this was only enough for a few days. Attacks and robberies became frequent on the roads. Desperate peasants stopped carts and robbed monasteries and royal warehouses. Even the church, which usually offered comfort, could not help. Monasteries, which always kept grain reserves, quickly emptied. Abbots begged kings for help, but they themselves had nothing to share. People prayed, held religious processions, and asked God for mercy. But the rains did not stop, the sun did not appear, and the fields remained muddy swamps. This was not a local famine that could be compensated for by supplies from neighboring regions. All of Northern Europe, from Ireland to Poland, from Scandinavia to the Alps, suffered at the same time. Trade routes were deserted, merchants stopped traveling because there was nothing to transport. Even rich cities like Bruges and Cologne, used to abundance, found themselves without supplies. Boats sat in ports, ships rusted at their moorings, and all of Europe seemed to freeze. Constant malnutrition made people weak. Men could not chop wood, women lost the strength to knead dough, and children wandered around begging for food. Diseases spread rapidly. Weakened bodies could not resist infection. Epidemics of dysentery and colds wiped out entire families. There was no one to plow the land, livestock died of cold and hunger, and life gradually faded away. It was a vicious circle. Hunger caused weakness. Weakness prevented work, and without work, there was no new food. People became prisoners of their own exhaustion. Even those who survived the winter did not have the strength to go out into the fields in the spring. There was no grain, no seeds left, and the waterlogged soil could not be plowed. The spring sowing of 1316 was a failure. This catastrophe lasted for more than 1 year. The consequences of the Great Famine were felt until the middle of the 14th century. The generation that survived it was forever marked by the fear of empty barns and the sound of rumbling stomachs. People learned to store more, divide what little they had into small portions, and view the rich with suspicion. The world became more cautious, harsher, and more distrustful. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of medieval society, one that is not usually talked about. In the era of the Great Famine and harsh winters, the most terrible thing was not the cold itself, but what it turned people into. We are accustomed to thinking of the Middle Ages as a time of close community ties, but this catastrophe showed how fragile they were. The trust that had sustained medieval life evaporated. Neighbors who had lived side by side for centuries began to view each other with suspicion. Food theft became commonplace. People hid food not only from strangers, but also from relatives. The institutions that were supposed to provide assistance were paralyzed. Monasteries, which traditionally served as shelters for the needy, found themselves on the brink of starvation. They closed their gates to the crowds of beggars because their own granaries were empty. The psychological pressure was unbearable. The constant feeling of hunger and cold, compounded by fear for tomorrow, led to deep despair. People lost faith not only in kings and the church, but also in the very meaning of their existence. Many, in desperation, left their homes and the lands where their families had lived for generations. The roads were filled with vagrants searching for a mythical place where food still remained. These migrations only spread chaos and despair across the continent. Some chronicles mention how villages literally died out, not because of disease, but because the inhabitants either left in search of a better life or simply became too weak to maintain their homes. The villages fell silent. The wealthy classes suffered less, but they too felt the impact. They could afford to buy grain at exorbitant prices, but this only provoked hatred from the starving population. The social gap between the elite and the common people became deeper than ever. This social collapse was perhaps the most terrible consequence of the climate catastrophe. It showed that civilization is a very thin layer that is easily destroyed in the face of natural disasters. Laws and morals only worked as long as people had food. This unique and tragic experience left a deep scar on Europe's collective memory. It took decades to restore not only the population, but also the lost trust between people. Winter froze not only the rivers, but also people's souls. If you appreciate such unconventional views on history, please like this video and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos about survival in the Middle Ages. What I am about to show you has only happened a few times in recorded history. Although the Great Famine of 1315 was a disaster caused by rain and crop failure, there were other winters that were just as terrible. One of the harshest was the winter of 1407-1408, which contemporaries simply called the Great Winter. This winter was marked by unprecedented, extreme frosts that gripped the whole of Europe. The cold was so severe that large and fast-flowing rivers, which normally never froze over, froze. Contemporaries wrote with horror about how the Thames in London and the Seine in Paris turned into icy roads. The freezing of the rivers meant a complete collapse of the economy. Rivers were the main transport arteries of the Middle Ages. They were used to transport grain, firewood, wine, and other goods. When they froze over, all trade stopped and cities were blockaded. Water mills, the main source of energy at the time, stopped working. The mill wheels froze into the ice and grain grinding ceased. Even those who had wheat reserves could not turn it into flour to bake bread. This exacerbated the food crisis. Travel by land became no less difficult. Roads, which were already in poor condition at the best of times, turned into impassable ice tracks. Wagons broke down, and draft oxen, not designed for such cold weather, were unable to pull loads. Entire regions became completely isolated. Villages cut off by snowdrifts and frost were left to fend for themselves. Communication between cities was interrupted. For many people, the world shrunk to the size of their own homes, where they desperately tried to keep the fire going. Fuel prices skyrocketed instantly. Firewood and peat became as valuable as gold. People chopped down everything that could burn, including fruit trees and gardens, and even parts of their own homes. Keeping warm became as important a task as finding food. The cold penetrated everywhere. Medieval stone castles, which seem so secure to us, were actually ice traps. The huge halls were impossible to heat. Lords and ladies wrapped themselves in furs and sat by fireplaces, that gave off no more heat than a bonfire in the middle of a field. Peasant huts made of wood and clay were not much better. An icy wind blew through the cracks in the walls. People slept huddled together, trying to keep each other warm. This winter was a real natural disaster that paralyzed life across the continent. It demonstrated the complete vulnerability of medieval society in the face of extreme cold. How did people manage to survive in such conditions? In the next chapter, we will learn how they coped with the main problem, finding fuel. In the icy world of the medieval winter, survival depended on one simple resource: fuel. Heat was not a luxury, but a necessity, and obtaining it became a daily struggle. The main source of heat was, of course, wood. The right to gather wood in the forest was strictly regulated. Peasants were usually only allowed to gather deadwood, dry branches that had fallen to the ground. Cutting down living trees, especially those belonging to a lord, was strictly forbidden. This created a constant shortage of fuel. In harsh winters, when deadwood quickly ran out, people took risks. Illegal tree felling became commonplace despite severe penalties. Violators who were caught faced heavy fines or corporal punishment, but the fear of freezing was stronger than the fear of the law. In densely populated areas, such as around large cities, forests were being cut down at an alarming rate. This led to a real fuel crisis. Firewood had to be transported from far away, which made it incredibly expensive and accessible only to wealthy city dwellers. When wood was in short supply, people turned to another source of fuel: peat. In regions with marshy terrain, such as the Netherlands, Ireland, or Scotland, peat was the main fuel for the poor. Its extraction was hard and dirty work. Peat was cut with special shovels into long, wet briquettes. These briquettes had to be dried throughout the summer to make them suitable for burning. If the summer was rainy, as it was in 1315, the peat did not dry out and people were left without fuel for the winter. Burning peat had its drawbacks. It produced less heat than wood and emitted a lot of acrid smoke. Homes heated with peat were constantly filled with smoke, which caused eye and lung problems for their inhabitants. The quality of fuel directly affected survival. Dry, hard woods burned for a long time and gave off a lot of heat. Wet or rotten wood barely smoldered, producing more smoke than fire. Knowing how to properly harvest and dry wood was one of the most important survival skills. Even in the castles of lords, keeping warm was a problem. The huge fireplaces in the great halls were inefficient. Most of the heat escaped up the chimney, and icy drafts swept through the hall. The only truly warm places were the private quarters, the solar, where there were smaller fireplaces. For a poor family, life in winter revolved around the hearth. It was a source of heat, light, and a place to cook food. When the fuel ran out, it meant not just cold, it meant the end of normal life and the beginning of a desperate struggle for survival. The secret that people were willing to pay a lot for in the Middle Ages was simple: good woolen clothing. In an era when modern insulation did not exist, wool was a person's main protection against the deadly cold. Its unique properties made it indispensable. The main advantage of wool was that it retained heat even when wet. In a damp climate, where rain and wet snow were constant companions, this was vital. Linen or cotton clothing, when wet, instantly took heat away from the body, while wool continued to keep it warm. Medieval people dressed according to the principle of layering. The basis was a long linen shirt that absorbed sweat. One or more woolen tunics were worn over it. The colder it was outside, the more layers a person wore. The outer garment was a heavy woolen cloak or cape. This item was critically important. The long, wide cloak protected the body from wind and precipitation, serving as a kind of portable shelter. Many poor people also used their cloaks as blankets at night. The quality of the wool was of great importance and was a direct indicator of status. Peasants wore clothes made of coarse, undyed wool, which was prickly but warm. The nobility and wealthy townspeople could afford fine, soft cloth, often dyed in bright colors. Protecting the feet and hands was also critically important. Woolen stockings or wraps called winnings protected the feet. Shoes were simple, made of leather, and often got wet. To keep the feet dry grass or moss was stuffed inside the boots as a makeshift insole. Mittens or gloves were not available to everyone. Peasants working in the cold often had to warm their hands in their sleeves or under their coats. Prolonged exposure to the cold without protection for the hands led to severe frostbite. Thus, the entire system of medieval clothing was built around one task: to preserve the precious warmth of the body. Wool, layers, and cloaks were the three pillars of survival in the icy hell. If the civilian population suffered from winter in their homes, for the army caught in the field, frost was a death sentence. Winter military campaigns in the Middle Ages were a rare and desperate undertaking. Most commanders preferred to disband their troops until spring. The main problem was not fighting the enemy, but fighting logistics. An army on the march consumes enormous amounts of food. In summer, troops could feed off the land, that is, forage for food in nearby villages. In winter, the land was dead and empty. This meant that the army had to carry all its provisions with it in a gigantic convoy. This required thousands of carts and draft oxen. The convoy stretched for kilometers and moved at a snail's pace along roads frozen or muddy from the thaw. A huge problem was feed for the draft oxen and cavalry horses themselves. There was no grass under the snow, so the army also had to carry fodder, hay, and oats. This cargo often exceeded the volume of food for the soldiers themselves. The soldiers suffered from the cold no less than from hunger. The army's supply of clothing was generally poor. Soldiers wore what they had left home in. Their clothes and shoes wore out quickly, got wet, and did not provide adequate protection from the cold. Maintaining discipline in a freezing and starving army was an almost impossible task. The soldiers were more concerned with finding firewood and food than following orders. Morale plummeted, and desertion became widespread. Sieging cities in winter was practically impossible. Siege weapons, such as catapults and trebuchets, could not operate in the cold. Wooden parts became brittle, and ropes lost their elasticity. Digging siege trenches in frozen ground was unrealistic. Many armies were defeated not by the enemy, but by winter itself. Logistical collapse, cold, and hunger destroyed troops more effectively than any swords or arrows. A commander who decided to wage a winter campaign risked losing his entire army without even engaging in battle. There are many examples of such disasters in history. Winter often became a decisive factor in wars, forcing kings and generals to accept that they were powerless against nature. The seasonal nature of war was not a choice, but a harsh necessity. Thus, winter effectively put the main activity of the Middle Ages, war, on hold. It was a time when even the most powerful kings could only sit in their castles and wait for nature to allow them to take up arms again. Winter in the Middle Ages meant not just cold, it meant isolation, the complete separation of people, lands, and even destinies. The modern network of roads, bridges, and transportation simply did not exist at that time. As soon as deep snow fell or the ground froze over, life seemed to stop. Wagons got stuck in snowdrifts, carts overturned in ditches, and travelers on foot lost their way in blizzards. Where caravans and merchants bustled in summer, silence and oblivion reigned in winter. Medieval roads were ordinary dirt tracks, trampled by the hooves of animals and the feet of travelers. They had no surface and were rarely repaired. In autumn, they were washed away by rain, turning into sticky swamps where wheels got stuck up to their hubs. When frost set in, the mud froze, turning the road into hard, bumpy ice. Wheels creaked, axles broke, and horses fell, unable to keep their footing on the slippery surface. Every journey became a torment, and sometimes a final one. Even the wealthiest nobles had no reliable means of traveling long distances. Roads were not cleared, bridges collapsed under the weight of snow, and fords froze over and became deadly traps. People traveled on hope rather than certainty. Sometimes they had to wait several days on the road for the blizzard to subside or for the crossing to thaw. Time lost its meaning. It turned into waiting for spring. This transport blockade had devastating consequences. Cities, especially large ones, depended on trade and food supplies. When the roads were closed, grain, salt, meat, and wine stopped coming in. The reserves made in the fall quickly dwindled. Food prices rose dramatically. People ate less, bakers diluted flour with husks, and butchers stretched their supplies by smoking them until they were black. In some places, famine began, especially among the poor. Trade practically ceased. Craftsmen could not sell their products, and merchants lost profits. Even those goods that were still available, spices, wax, fabrics, cost an incredible amount of money. In winter, the rich stocked up in advance, and the poor survived on what they had managed to preserve. Winter isolation destroyed economic ties, turning each estate into a separate island of survival. But the isolation was not only physical, it also became informational. Messengers, couriers, and postal workers could not traverse the snowy roads. Letters from kings, orders, reports, all of this got stuck on the way. Sometimes a message sent in winter would only arrive in spring, when its meaning had already lost its significance. States lived in ignorance, not knowing what was happening in neighboring lands. Even papal bulls and decrees from crowned heads could be delayed for months. This led to chaos. Soldiers could wait for orders that never came, cities for taxes that were not collected, and monasteries for offerings that were not received. Kings lost contact with their governors, who acted at their own discretion. During such periods, power weakened, and each region turned into a small state, governed by its own forces. For remote villages and monasteries, winter was a time of almost complete seclusion. Small settlements were cut off from the world for 3 or 4 months. Snow covered the paths like a thick carpet, and no one came or went. Only the wind reminded them that somewhere far away, life still went on. People spent the winter waiting for spring, counting the days and nights. This feeling of isolation had a strong effect on the human psyche. The world shrank to the size of the house in the nearest barn. Conversations were only about food, fuel, and the health of livestock. The planning horizon narrowed to the next dawn. No one made long-term plans. In winter, you just had to survive. Every evening became a test, and every morning a victory. Frozen rivers sometimes became a salvation. If the ice was strong enough, temporary roads were built on it. People, carts, and even wagons moved directly along the riverbed where water splashed in the summer. This shortened the journey, but it was always dangerous. The current raged beneath the thick ice, and the slightest crack could cost lives. Therefore, only the most courageous and desperate traveled on such ice roads. Travelers caught in bad weather were at particularly high risk. There were few inns, and those that did exist quickly became overcrowded. Dozens of people could sleep in one room. Merchants, wandering monks, soldiers. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of sweat, but no one complained. The main thing was not to sleep under the open sky. Life in the cities also came to a standstill. Market squares were deserted. Caravans did not come. Ships stood at the docks, frozen in the ice. There was less work, money was running out, and people spent their days waiting for spring. Those who could did crafts at home. They repaired shoes, sewed clothes, and sharpened knives. But the longing for the road, for movement and news remained in everyone's heart. Thus, winter in the Middle Ages was a time of broken connections. It severed trade routes, hindered ambassadors and merchants, and separated families and kingdoms. Every city and every village was left to fend for itself. Catastrophic winters and famine years, such as the Great Famine, did not pass without a trace. They left deep scars on European society, and their consequences were felt for decades. It was not just a temporary inconvenience, but a demographic and economic blow. Many villages, especially in less fertile areas, were completely abandoned. People either moved to cities or simply disappeared. These lost villages are still being found by archaeologists and serve as silent monuments to that era. The economy was devastated. Vast areas of arable land were abandoned and overgrown with forest. It took generations to bring them back into agricultural use. The elite of society, the feudal lords, lost their income as there were fewer and fewer peasants able to work their land. There were also changes in agriculture. Peasants who had survived the famine became wary of wheat, which was vulnerable to rain. They began to switch to more resilient crops such as rye, oats, or barley, which could survive a bad summer. In some regions, people abandoned risky farming altogether. They switched to animal husbandry, particularly sheep farming. Pastures were less dependent on the weather than fields. This, in turn, gave impetus to the development of the wool industry. The social consequences were also enormous. Trust in both secular and ecclesiastical authorities was undermined. People saw that neither prayers nor royal decrees could save them from starvation. This sowed seeds of doubt that later sprouted during the Reformation and peasant revolts. The psychological scar remained for a long time. Fear of famine and harsh winters became part of European folklore and mentality. The idea that nature was a hostile force that needed to be tamed took root in people's minds.
Grab what you can from the fields.
The great winter disasters of the Middle Ages were a cruel but effective teacher. They forced European society to become more flexible, seek new technologies, and change established practices. They showed the limits of medieval civilization's growth. These events were one of the factors that triggered the transformation from the High Middle Ages to the modern era. They demonstrated that humanity is not the sole master of the planet, and that climate is a powerful force capable of changing the course of history at any moment. We can see that winter in the Middle Ages was not just a season. It was an annual test of survival and, at times, a full-scale catastrophe. Forgotten winter disasters, such as the Great Famine or the Great Winter of 1407, were no less devastating than wars. They changed the economy, society, and even people's way of thinking. These harsh times revealed the incredible vulnerability of humans to the elements, but they also demonstrated their remarkable ability to adapt. The search for new fuels, changes in agriculture, and the creation of warmer clothing were all responses to the challenge posed by nature. The history of these winter disasters is a reminder of how fragile our familiar world is and how highly valued simple things were in the past: bread, warmth, and safety.